Good to see those of you who are joining us. Glad that you are here. We're going to start in just a couple of minutes, and I'm starting the YouTube webinar so that those who are watching on YouTube can join us. But if you're in the Zoom, I'm glad you're here. We'll start in just a few minutes. A few more minutes before we start. I have that it's 10 o'clock, so we'll go ahead and get started. If you are watching on YouTube, we're glad you're with us. If you are watching live and you would like to participate in the discussion, you can join us in the Zoom webinar using a link that's found on our church's website. I've pasted the address where you can find that link in the chat on the YouTube. You can also find it in our church's website under Grow and Adult Forum. I'm not able to receive questions or comments from the YouTube stream, but on the Zoom webinar, it gives us the chance to share those comments with each other. And if you're on the Zoom webinar, I'm glad you're here. Brian, Haley, Robert. The Q&A feature is the best way to get those comments to me. I'm not able to watch the chat reliably, but the Q&A feature on a webinar is a good way to do that. So if you type your comment or your question, then I'll be able to see it and I'll be able to respond accordingly. But it is good that we are here. Let me get my prayer book. Where'd it go? Where'd it go? Let's use, It's troubling when the priest has lost his prayer book, isn't it? I wonder where it went. Let's find another prayer book. Not the one in Spanish, that won't help me very much. Let's use, it's really disconcerting, isn't it? Oh well. There's a beautiful prayer for poor and neglected persons, which I've enjoyed offering each week as we've begun our work. But I can't find my my tangible prayer book, my that prayer book at least. But I think I can find it quickly enough on the online version. So let me offer this prayer. It's on page 826 for what it's worth, but this is a prayer for the poor and neglected. Let's start our time together with this prayer. Almighty and most merciful God, we remember before you all poor and neglected persons whom it would be easy for us to forget. The homeless and the destitute, the old and the sick, and all who have none to care for them. Help us to heal those who are broken in body or spirit, and to turn their sorrow into joy. Grant this, Father, for the love of your Son, who for our sake became poor, Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. That prayer is not only a beautiful prayer to ground our time, but it also provides a bit of a review for our class. If you haven't been with us before, don't worry. You can certainly watch the previous episodes on our YouTube channel, but let me give you a little bit of background. We started with Old Testament texts, and then in the second week, we looked at New Testament texts. And then last week, we looked at texts from theologians throughout the ages, some early first and second century theologians, but also some contemporary theologians. And the idea that I was trying to present to us is that throughout our religious tradition, in the Judeo-Christian tradition, not only are we called to respond to the needs of the poor, that is perhaps universal in the religious framework. It doesn't really matter what faith you are in, except for maybe some of these really screwy ones, Scientology perhaps. But almost universally, there is a call to care for the poor and the neglected among us. That's universal. But what I want to hold up to us is that one of the, if not unique, one of the important distinguishing characteristics of the Judeo-Christian tradition is not only the command to care for the poor, but the invitation to understand who God is by inhabiting the life and example of the poor. The end of that collect reminds us that Jesus Christ, for our sakes, became poor. In the Old Testament language, when God's people had moved into the land that had been promised to their ancestor, they were to bring their first fruit offering to the place of assembly, and they were to rehearse this language of history. My ancestor was a wandering Aramean, and we were slaves. We were set free, and into this land we have been brought, and God has provided our bounty. And so the understanding of our bounty, the understanding even of our salvation, is clearest when we see how God meets the needs of the poor. Not only how we meet the needs of the poor, but how God meets the needs of the poor. So as such, when we as people of faith focus on the poor, we are not only helping out those in need, we are helping ourselves understand more fully who we are, who God is, and how salvation itself works. Some of the language from last week in particular that sticks out to me is how many times, especially in the early church, and I was surprised to see how prominent this was in the 2nd and 3rd century, 4th century texts, but how often theologians would remind us that the food in our cupboard and the clothes in our closet and the money in our bank account does not belong to us. It belongs to the one who needs it. The person experiencing homelessness, the person experiencing poverty, the person who does not have enough to make it. What we think of as ours doesn't belong to us. It belongs to them. And so the connection between our wealth and the suffering of those around us is immediate in our religious tradition. So that's kind of the background, what we've built upon. Today, I kind of want to spin that around. And so if you haven't been with us until today, don't worry. But everything that we're going to talk about today starts with our current circumstance and invites us, if we believe, and I'm asking you to join me in this, if we believe together that it is our duty not only to respond to the needs of the poor, but it is our duty as people of faith to pursue who God is and who God is calling us to be through the experience of poverty, then that shifts and shapes what we have to do in our culture, in our society, how we spend our money, how we talk about God, how we practice our faith and our religion. So today I want to talk about the needs around us and also some specific examples of what we might do and sort of the radical invitation to rethink what it means to be church, if indeed church is primarily a concern for the poor and an invitation to salvation through the lens of the poor being rescued. So let's look at some text. I want to start with an audio clip, and I'm going to share my sound through this audio clip. And I'll warn you that when I've done this in the past, the audio coming through has been remarkably loud, a lot louder than my voice. So you might want to be attending to your volume button in case it comes through too loud for you. But I want to play the first 5 or so minutes of this NPR report, and you can see on the website there that it's a 49-minute listen. We're not going to listen to the whole thing. It's worth it. But I was listening to this, and that's what helped me begin to think about this as a series that we needed to address. So let's listen to the first 5 minutes of this 50-minute report. And the questions I'm inviting you to consider are, first, how has the pandemic revealed to us the extent of poverty in our own community? And second, how are we as people of faith called to respond to it? That's kind of the background for our entire class today. But let's listen to this, keeping in mind that it might come through too loudly. Let me also ask that if you can't hear it, would one of you please share on the Q&A feature so that I'll know it's not coming through? But here we go.
This is a special report from NPR News on food insecurity in the United States. I'm Michelle Martin. It's one of the most urgent yet sometimes hidden crises this country is facing. We're talking about not having enough food or not having enough good, nutritious food when you need it. Now, poverty and food insecurity have always existed here in the U.S., but the pandemic, as it has with almost everything, has made the problem worse for many across the country. A poll of households in the 4 largest U.S. cities by NPR, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and Harvard's T.H. Chan School of Public Health found that in Houston, for example, 1 in 3 households have had serious problems affording food since the coronavirus outbreak began. And about 1 in 5 don't get enough food to eat every day. We're going to hear about the personal toll of hunger, the systems that are meant to provide assistance and where they fall short, and the people working on finding solutions. To begin, we wanted to understand the scale of the crisis, so we've called on Reverend Eugene Cho. He is the president and CEO of Bread for the World. That's a faith-based nonprofit working to enact policies addressing hunger globally. Reverend Cho, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, Reverend Cho, let me start by saying that we know this is a global problem, and we're going to talk about these global issues. But for now, we want to focus on the U.S. Do we have any way of quantifying how much worse the crisis has gotten since the pandemic began?
Well, first of all, I'm so glad that you're covering this topic. The numbers are staggering, and I think this is the reason why it's hard for us to quantify. We're talking 54 million people in our backyards, in our cities, in our nation right now. That's about 1 in 6 Americans. And certainly is impacting children particularly very heavy.
And talk a little bit more about that. I was going to ask you about that. Are there specific groups of people that are especially vulnerable?
Well, we've heard it said now that the pandemic, as well as its secondary consequences, it's impacting children, especially Black and brown families, African American, Latino families. In fact, the recent Census Bureau data indicates that nearly 40% of Black and Latino families with children are struggling to put food on the table.
So what are some of the main drivers of food insecurity in the United States? And is it different from what's driving food insecurity elsewhere in the world? I just want to mention here that according to the United Nations World Food Program, about 265 million people are facing life-threatening levels of food insecurity globally. So what are the drivers around the world? And is it the same or different in the United States?
It's a little different. A few years ago, what led to some of the hunger crisis around the world was conflict, climate change, and then when you place on top of those things the reality of the global COVID-19 pandemic, there's been an extreme lockdown globally. I think there are some nations that have seen countries like the United States, Brazil, India, have these tremendous high infection rates. And so their government have gone into these extreme lockdowns. So some people might see these statistics of infections globally, and they might be surprised that the infection rate isn't as high at the same rate as the United States. So less people are dying because of COVID, but what they are being dramatically impacted by is the food systems. People just aren't able to access the food.
I think a lot of people are surprised that there is a food insecurity problem in the United States, because I think people will say, well, gee, what about these programs that I hear so much about? What about these programs that I'm paying my taxes for?
Well, I think it's a fair question. So just to maybe take us back about a year, the census reported that in 2019 in the United States, we had the lowest poverty rate since the government started tracking it. So that's really tremendous progress. The safety net programs that you mentioned, things like the SNAP program, the WIC program, those were working, and those were taking people away from the safety net programs to be able to, again, assume life on their own. But I think what this pandemic has caused is explosion exploited some of the fragility of our lives, of our society, and of our safety net as well. And so as a result, organizations like Bread for the World, we're calling upon our lawmakers, upon Congress, upon the White House to amplify. We need to strengthen these safety net programs during this time because it makes sense. This is a unprecedented epidemic that we're facing. So the nation and our lawmakers, we need to act in a tremendously unprecedented, compassionate, empathetic way to help those who are suffering from the hunger crisis right now.
I hope you were able to hear that well and to follow it. There were a couple of just tidbits, even in that first 5 minutes. The rest is worth a listen. You can find it, NPR, Food Insecurity. You can find that report, and it's worth listening to the whole thing. A couple of things, though, just sort of jump out at me. I'm curious about you. Were there any aspects of that 5 minutes that you found interesting or surprising? Any tidbits that you hold on to even now? Remember to use the Q&A feature if you're watching on the YouTube link. We're glad that you're here. You're welcome to join us if you're watching live in the discussion, navigating over to the Zoom webinar using the link there in the chat. You can find that on our website. But anybody who heard that audio clip, any response that you would offer, anything that caught your eye or your ear? Yeah, things just feel like they're backsliding, Haley notes. Yeah, absolutely. In lots of ways, in the clip, and in anticipation of this, as I did research for it, I was surprised to realize that before the pandemic hit, poverty was, as you heard in that clip, at its lowest level. Poverty, and that includes in Arkansas. The Arkansas poverty rate is about 6% greater than the national average. The national average is about 10.5, and Arkansas is about 16.5. 16.5% of Arkansas residents live at or below the poverty line. And yet that represents progress. And yet because of the pandemic, in ways that we all kind of, I think, anticipated, but it takes a while for those statistics to show up and to begin to shape our response. The reality of poverty has become sort of overwhelming in response to the pandemic or as a consequence of the pandemic. And so, of course, as the pandemic numbers regress, as we get worse and worse, we can also anticipate that the same would be true for the needs of the poor and the food insecure. Any other responses? Any other responses? 1 in 3 residents of Houston have trouble finding enough food. 1 in 5 don't get enough food. That's just a Houston number. I wonder what that number is like in other communities. Yeah. Haley responds, and I appreciate, Haley, you keeping the conversation going. The money that kept our most vulnerable afloat didn't just disappear. Where did the money go? And are we hoarding it? And what does hoarding mean? We heard, didn't we, in one of the readings from last week, I think it might have been Francis, the Bishop of Rome, who talked about hoarding. I can't remember which one, but one of them said, hoarding is an expression of our sinfulness. And the scriptures are clear about that. When Jesus says, let tomorrow worry about tomorrow, look at the birds, look at the lilies, Jesus isn't asking us to close our eyes and hope that everything will turn out okay. Jesus is asking us to trust that we have enough, and that when we have enough, everyone will also have enough. Kristen notes, 1 in 6 in the United States. Yeah, 1 in 6. 1 in 6 in our backyard, right? 50 plus million people in our. I love the turn of phrase that Bread for the World leader offers, that in our backyard, how remarkable homelessness, how remarkably widespread food insecurity is. Since that came out, I've heard a couple of commercials on the air, those public service announcements on the radio. I listen to the radio when I'm in the car, and a couple of them have asked, what does homelessness look like in your community? And it doesn't look like what you think it does. It's the colleague who sort of grabs leftovers from the trash can at the office in order to have enough for her kids. I mean, they're not hiding from us, but they're hiding in plain sight. We think of people who are food insecure as being people who are experiencing homelessness, people who show up at community meals or Salvation Army or St. James to receive meals. But in fact, there are people who are working who don't have enough to eat because the other sources of income in their life have disappeared, or their hours or their income have been cut back, or their needs have gone up. And as a result, as we talk a lot about in our household, there are people that we know, people in my children's classrooms, whose parents have to decide: are we going to have our maintenance medication, our blood pressure medication, our diabetes medication, or are we going to make sure our kids get enough to eat? Yeah, that's the calculus that's happening even in our relatively affluent community, for sure. Yeah. Let me share another screen, and we're gonna read 3 different articles. We're not gonna read the whole thing. I'm going to share. I've copied the text from this New York Times article. You can. It doesn't say New York Times. It should. Let me just add it right there. These are 3 articles from the New York Times. I've copied the text because whenever I'm looking at it on the internet browser, all the ads and movement, it makes my computer freeze when I'm trying to do a Zoom and a live stream. So forgive me, but I've copied this text from these articles. We're not going to read all of it, but we're going to read part of it, and I've bolded the parts that I want to read to help me remember. But this is from just 10 days ago. 8 million have slipped into poverty since May as federal aid has dried up, by Jason DeParle. And let me read parts of this article. Then we're going to read a bit about college students in particular. And then actually, there's 2 articles from the New York Times. And then we're going to shift conversation away from addressing specific need and to begin to talk about sort of policy changes and systemic structural changes that we might support or that we might be a part of to not only address needs, but to address poverty. So let me read first, though. This is from an October 15th article from the New York Times. After an ambitious expansion of the safety net in the spring saved millions of people from poverty, the aid is now largely exhausted, and poverty has returned to levels higher than before the coronavirus, 2 new studies have found. The number of poor people has grown by 8 million since May, according to researchers at Columbia University, after falling by 4 million at the pandemic's start as a result of a $2 trillion emergency package known as the CARES Act. Using a different definition of poverty, researchers from the University of Chicago and Notre Dame found that poverty has grown by 6 million people in the last 3 months, with circumstances worsening for most Black people and children. These numbers are very concerning, said Bruce D. Meyer, an economist at the University of Chicago and an author of the study. They tell us people are having a lot more trouble paying their bills, paying their rent, putting food on the table. Underscoring those concerns, the Labor Department reported on Thursday, remember this is 2 weeks ago, the Labor Department reported on Thursday that about 886,000 people filed new claims for unemployment benefits last week, an increase of nearly 77,000 or 9.5% from the previous week. Adjusted for seasonal variations, the total was 898,000. The recent rise in poverty has occurred despite an improving job market since May, an indication that the economy had been rebounding too slowly to offset the lost benefits. And now the economy is showing new signs of deceleration amid layoffs, a surge in coronavirus cases, and deadlocked talks in Washington over new stimulus. I'm going to skip a couple of paragraphs to read another bit about a particular story. Among those experiencing new hardships is Kristen Jeffcoat, 24, who is raising 3 children in Camptonville, California, a hamlet about 80 miles north of Sacramento. When schools closed last spring, Ms. Jeffcoat, an Instacart shopper, stayed home to watch them. Then her husband got laid off from landscaping work. The expanded safety net initially caught them. Together, they received more than $1,500 a week in jobless benefits, which exceeded their lost wages. They also received a $3,900 stimulus check, which they used to prepay 3 months of rent. But since the unemployment bonus ended in July, their cash income has fallen nearly 80%. Now living on $350 a week plus food stamps, Ms. Jeffcoat and her husband have gone without electricity because they cannot afford generator fuel, their house is off the power grid, and have spent weeks without propane for cooking and hot showers. We stick with cold meals, cereals, she said. To feed the children, Ms. Jeffcoat said she sometimes skips meals, especially at the end of the month when the food stamps have run out. Her husband sold his tools to buy diapers, and Ms. Jeffcoat tried to sell her eggs to a fertility clinic, but she did not medically qualify. Worse than the physical hardships is the worry. I've definitely found myself feeling a little more anxious, snappier with the children, Ms. Jeffcoat said. Income volatility is especially hard on low-income families who lack the savings or credit to keep essential bills paid. It acts as a kind of invisible tax. measured in units as varied as late fees, toxic stress, and worse school outcomes for children. Quote, the lack of predictability has all kinds of negative consequences, said Bradley L. Hardy, an economist at American University, who notes that the recent benefit fluctuations amplify economic gyrations. What I hear in that is what I think we all assume to be true, but many of us have been fortunate enough to escape the reality of that, which is that because so many aspects of our lives are slowing down, that consequence very quickly spreads, trickles down throughout our community. When schools are not open, parents can't work, and yet there's no one stepping in to provide them with the income. When schools are open, then parents, in theory, can work unless they work in a kind of a job or industry where layoffs are widespread, landscaping, restaurant work, service industry, and the like. That trickles down very quickly. We keep pointing our fingers somewhere, but nobody has been willing to step in and provide that. And of course, there's a political element to that. There's some conflict over whether a second round of stimulus is an electioneering attempt, and who's going to support it, and will it be supported, and the like. But the consequences of us not having that direct assistance is that more and more people find themselves without basic income, and as Ms. Jeffcoat's story shows, more and more people are having to go without. And I don't just mean go without luxuries. Going without power, going without heat, is going without food. Those are the real consequences. The other thing I wanted to hold up from that article, which perhaps you've experienced to be true, is that bit at the end about the gyrations, the ups and the downs, and how economic fluctuations in income, become almost an invisible tax upon those who are not financially secure because of late fees. Because if you're having to make a decision between whether to pay this bill or that bill, late fees are the result. And so even though you might want to cut back where you can, the consequence is you continue to have to pay those late fees, and it becomes a vicious cycle. And the longer you miss, the harder it is to make it up, even when the income comes back. Let me give you an example from our community. There have been wide-ranging evictions in our community. That was both not only in that gap of time between when evictions were forestalled, and more recently when they've again been forestalled. There was a gap in the middle when evictions were apparently legal. But even in addition to that, even in the times when they were not allowed, eviction notices still are being processed. The federal government, the Federal Housing Authority, has said that you cannot be evicted right now. However, it hasn't offered to cover the rent payments. And so our anticipation is that even if someone is allowed to stay in their home, and often it takes a lawyer or another legal advocate to argue that this person shouldn't be evicted. When you get an eviction notice from your landlord, and you can imagine the sheriff coming and turning all your property out on the street, it's difficult to then find the time and the energy and the voice to argue back that that's not allowed. Who's going to listen to you? So we have to find legal assistance to make the argument that the eviction is not legal, and yet there's no promise that the missed rent is going to be provided. And let's be fair, landlords, they're having to put food on their kids' table as well. And until we find a way to step in and intervene, not only to forestall evictions, but to provide the income necessary for us to stay in our homes, then we're facing a great deadline that it will all come due eventually. Our friends in the Marshallese community have been profoundly affected by this because, to a greater extent, they work in poultry plants or in other manufacturing places where there's close proximity. The coronavirus has spread more significantly and to greater consequence through the Marshallese community because healthcare is not given to those from the Marshallese community. They're not eligible for those public benefits, and as a result, they're more profoundly affected because they often have chronic health conditions. As a result, they can't work. As a result, they can't pay rent. As a result, they get eviction notices. Those might get forestalled, but what happens when it all comes due? Who's going to step in? That's the reality we're living with. Haley notes there's been a horrible cycle of letting coworkers go, hiring again, letting go again. And she's experienced this, and others have too. Of course, we feel, these are her words, we feel like we are just white knuckling it at work, and it's stressing everyone out. Anytime we have enough money at work right now, it's an unexpected fluke. Yeah. Brian White says another added burden is fines in traffic cases. Brian is an attorney in Alabama. Another added burden is fines in traffic cases and criminal cases. But the problem doesn't generate a lot of sympathy until people realize that the system is overwhelmingly funded by those funds. They may be necessary in some amount, but it is food out of dependents' mouths. Absolutely, that's right. The debtor's prison. We continue to propagate debtor's prison, even though it's unconstitutional in this country. We levy lots of fines, and the whole judicial system in places like Fayetteville, Arkansas, and Decatur, Alabama, the judicial system is propped up by these court costs, these filing fees, these traffic fines, these criminal defense. So when you get arrested for a DWI, it's not just as simple as paying your fine or going to jail. The fines are enormous. Then you lose your income. Your family is going without. And what have we done to address the underlying problem? These aren't just 22-year-olds who are having too much fun on a Friday night. These are people who have to work to put food on the table, and how will they work? That's the reality. I saw someone posted on Facebook, and if you're watching, I'm talking about you. I won't name who you are, but someone posted on Facebook, I have to pass a drug test to get a job. Why shouldn't you have to pass a drug test to get welfare? Basically, it's even more cutting language than that. Drug screening has often become a popular contingency for welfare, but I'm curious whether we would let someone starve to death because they have an addiction, or whether we let someone's children starve to death or be turned out on the street because one of their parents has an addiction. Addiction is an illness. It's not a lifestyle choice. Neither is cancer. We don't kick kids on the street because their parents have cancer. And so our whole conversation about mental illness, about addiction, about monetizing monetizing mistakes or monetizing the consequences of addiction trickle all the way down through our community. It is creating poverty. It's making it harder for us to respond to the needs of the poor. Absolutely. All right, so I'm going to share another screen. You can tell I really enjoy this topic, and I hope you do as well. This hits really close to home here in Fayetteville, a college town, and this is the reality that we are seeing, and it's only begun to be revealed to us. And we anticipate that for years, maybe even for a generation, that this could have a significant consequence, a long-lasting, far-reaching consequence. This is the reality of what the pandemic is doing to poor college students in particular. So let me read some sections from this. Again, a New York Times article published originally on October the 12th, and then updated 10 days later. So let me read these sections for you. Michelle Macario was struggling to follow online classes through the tiny screen of her smartphone. She had no laptop and no Wi-Fi at home, and the library where she normally studied at her community college in Los Angeles was closed. So 2 weeks into the coronavirus shutdown in the spring, she dropped all of her courses to avoid failing. Things are not much better this semester. Ms. Macario, 18, who is majoring in psychology at Santa Monica College, left the crowded apartment in Los Angeles that she shared with her immigrant family from Guatemala and has been crashing with her sister and friends. But the Wi-Fi is unreliable. She is living too far away from her hospital internship, and she toils to tap out exams and homework on her phone. Between the internet, COVID, and couch surfing, I haven't been able to do a good semester, Ms. Macario said. Trapped between the financial hardships of the pandemic and the technological hurdles of online learning, the millions of low-income college students across America face mounting obstacles in their quests for higher education. Some have simply dropped out, as Ms. Macario did previously, while others are left scrambling to find housing and internet access amid campus closures and job losses. Every part of this pandemic is hitting low-income students hardest, and they were already in bad shape to begin with, said Sarah Goldrick-Rab, the founding director of the Hope Center for College, Community and Justice at Temple University, which studies the economic challenges facing college students. Some colleges and universities have increased financial aid to students in need, but others, facing their own financial challenges, have said they cannot afford to offer more. The federal stimulus package passed in March that provided $7 billion for student expenses, such as food, housing, and healthcare has largely been depleted, and Republicans have balked at passing further relief proposed by Democrats. President Trump pulled out of and then tried to restart negotiations for additional aid last week. The impact on struggling students can be seen most clearly at the nation's roughly 1,400 community colleges, where nearly half of students start seeking degrees. Enrollment there declined by 8% this fall, compared with a 2.5% drop in undergraduate enrollment overall, according to the National Student Clearinghouse Research Center in Herndon, Virginia, which tracks college enrollment data. The decline amounts to about 500,000 fewer community college students, said Martha Parham, a spokeswoman for the American Association of Community Colleges, an advocacy group in Washington. Unlike in previous economic recessions, when community colleges saw a surge in enrollment, the pandemic has had the opposite effect. Most community college students work, Ms. Parham said, and many are parents. Home internet access and computers are sometimes unaffordable for them. If they have lost their job because of the pandemic, now they're faced with, how do I pay rent? How do I feed my kids? Ms. Parham said, adding that for those students, classes are not a top priority right now. For students who do drop out, there is little chance they will return. Just 13% of college dropouts re-enroll in courses, according to a report released last year. Once you stop going, Ms. Parham said, it is much more difficult to start back up again. And let me skip ahead and read of this particular experience. Before the pandemic, Matt Bodo, 22, was homeless for 2 years while taking community college classes and working full-time as a waiter and valet in Northern California. He was occasionally able to sleep on a friend's sofa, but he mostly lived in his car, a rusted old Ford Mustang. For internet access, he would spend as much time as possible on campus, where he could also shower. Last year, Mr. Bodo transferred to the University of California, Los Angeles, where he is majoring in linguistics and psychology and settled into a shared dorm room. But he could not afford the cost for housing after the pandemic hit, and the school required students to pay more for single rooms. His younger sister, a community college student in the Bay Area, lost her housing in early April, and he returned to help her. Few of his quarantine friends were willing to take them in, so soon they were both sleeping in their cars. This term has been somewhat better. Nonprofit groups have helped him afford a UCLA dorm, but even with financial assistance and 3 jobs, Mr. Bodo is struggling to pay for classes and to support his sister, who is still couch surfing and needs money for community college. If he cannot make ends meet, Mr. Bodo said, he will become homeless again in order to cover her rent. She's my little sister, and I hate to see her struggle, he said. In my heart, I put her before me, even if that means I'm living in my car. I'm not asking you to share your personal story, but imagine, maybe you even have experienced it firsthand, what it's like to have to sleep in a car. We think of homelessness as manifesting itself among those who sleep either in shelters or under bridges or in tents. But the number of people without permanent housing is far greater. Those who couch surf, those who move from one relative or one friend to another, is substantial. What I take from that article in particular is how hard it is to couch surf or to stay with friends when we're all quarantining, especially when you're working in a kind of job that brings you into close contact with lots of people. When the rules are that if you come into close contact with someone, even if you haven't tested positive, that you need to stay isolated for 14 days. Isolated where? In your car? The reality of homelessness, the reality of homelessness for those who are experiencing homelessness is profound. I forget often what that means for college students. One of the ministries that we are able to provide through St. Martin's, our university center, is to repackage food and deliver it to food insecure students. You'd be surprised, I bet, as I am too, at how many college students are food insecure because their financial aid doesn't cover food for those who are poor. They just don't have the resources they need to feed themselves. But when the university cafeteria is closed, we can't repackage that food and distribute it. And so we're grateful that it's open, but also that's again a pandemic risk. As the pandemic sets in, as you heard in the article, single housing, availability of food, availability of the internet, shared computers in a library setting or a computer lab setting. Those resources go away when we are not able to meet in person. And as in particular, that has profoundly decrease the number of people who are enrolling in colleges. In Decatur, Alabama, where I was before this, the largest community college in Alabama, a Calhoun Community College. I haven't looked at the numbers, but that's a profound employer and a resource, an intellectual hub in the community. I wonder what the pandemic has meant for them and if what we see in that article holds true. Let me share one more article with you because I want to switch gears. We're a little over halfway through our class, and I kind of want to switch gears and instead of only talking about the immediate need, I want to start talking about the response to that need. And I want to share with you an article that I shared on Facebook. If we're friends on Facebook, I shared it publicly. You might have seen it as well. But here is an article, and then I'll watch a video that kind of reinforces this. CNN covered this study that was done by the New Leaf Project. And it raises the question of what is the most effective way to respond to poverty, and in particular to the blight of homelessness that continues to affect those in our community. So this was produced on October the 9th, so still fairly recent. This is from CNN, and I've copied it from their website. You've heard this refrain before. Before giving money to homeless, you've heard this refrain before. Giving money to homeless people is not the best way to help them because it might be squandered or spent on harmful habits. But a new Canadian study makes a powerful case to the contrary. The study, dubbed the New Leaf Project, is an initiative of Foundations for Social Change, a charitable organization based in Vancouver in partnership with the University of British Columbia. Researchers gave 50 recently homeless people a lump sum of 7,500 Canadian dollars, or nearly 5,700 American dollars. They followed the cash recipient's life over 12 to 18 months and compared their outcomes to that of a control group who didn't receive the payment. The preliminary findings, which will be peer-reviewed next year, show that those who received cash were able to find stable housing faster on average. By comparison, those who didn't receive cash lagged about 12 months behind in securing more permanent housing. People who received cash were able to access the food they needed to live faster. Nearly 70% did after 1 month and maintained greater food security throughout the year. The recipients spent more on food, clothing, and rent, while there was a 39% decrease in spending on goods like alcohol, cigarettes, or drugs. The homeless population continues to grow, and we keep applying the same old approaches, said Claire Williams, the CEO and co-founder of Foundations for Social Change. We really think it's important to start testing meaningful risk-taking in the name of social change, Williams added. One of the things that was most striking is that most people who received the cash knew immediately what they wanted to do with that money. And that just flies in the face of stereotypes, Williams told CNN. For example, she explained some cash recipients knew that they wanted to use the money to move into housing or invest in transportation, getting a bike, or taking their cars to the repair shop to be able to keep other jobs. Others wanted to purchase computers. A number of them wanted to start their own small businesses. People very much know what they need, but we often don't equip them with the intervention or the services that really empower them with choice and dignity to move forward on their own terms, Williams said. Direct cash transfers are not a silver bullet for homelessness in general, and the program focused on a higher functioning subset of the homeless population, Williams said. But she believes the research shows that providing meaningful support to folks who have recently become homeless decreases the likelihood that they will become entrenched in the experience. People who received the cash infusions were even able to set some money aside, about 1,000 Canadian dollars on average, through 12 months. The money provided by the program also had trickle-down impacts, according to Williams, with people investing more in their children's well-being and needs, as well as helping out family members. These are the hidden impacts that we just don't anticipate and aren't necessarily quantifying, but now we're seeing that this is having an exponential effect on people's lives, Williams explained. The study shows that there are advantages for the taxpayer too. According to the research, reducing the number of nights spent in shelters by the 50 study participants who received cash saved approximately 8,100 Canadian dollars per person per year, or about 405,000 Canadian dollars over 1 year for all 50 participants. There's a common misconception that the cost of doing nothing is free or cheap, and it absolutely is not. What do you think about that? What do you think about? Do you have any experience with this? Are you a part of any groups or organizations or any kind of maybe civic groups that have begun to advocate for direct cash payments to those who are poor? If you, like me, grew up hearing "Don't give money to someone who is experiencing homelessness because they'll just use it in irresponsible ways," that there's a sort of a culture of dominance, of colonialism, of oppression behind those words. Like, I will tell you what's best for you. And isn't it interesting that those those political and economic movements that advocate for individual liberty and individual freedom uh, typically sound like those who actually say the opposite when it comes to helping the poor. That actually we can't trust them with that. That's perhaps an oversimplification, but that's kind of the language that I hear. My instinct is to say, no, no, no. We need to be more careful with how we spend those resources. But who would know better than those who are experiencing poverty or homelessness themselves? And what a wonderful invitation to change my presumption and my privilege in that way. Other responses to that article, other things that you think about. It's remarkable to me how quickly individuals know what they need. We have an individual who is up at the church almost every day. He's a kind of a staple here, a friend of some of us on Facebook. And every once in a while, resources come his way, and he knows exactly what he needs to do to provide sustainable housing for himself. And when he got a stimulus check, we didn't see him for several months because he was able to provide short-term housing. But his income disappears pretty quickly, and he's not able to do that long term. And so we continue. Every once in a while, he'll say, I really could use some help getting this or that, because there are a couple of pieces in place, and if they fall in place, then I'm able to get this piece that I need. I just need help with this little bit. And given how little we communicate verbally with one another and how much of a fixture he is at the church every single day, it's interesting to me how quickly I underestimate how much he is able to kind of anticipate what he needs to get where he wants to go. Susan Mays asked a question: what is typical of our clergy reaction to a person that comes to you for gas, rent, or whatever they need? That's a great question. Typically, the answer is yes. If there's a means by which I can offer that assistance. So sometimes it's just not. Sometimes it just doesn't work. We don't keep cash at the church. It takes two people to sign checks. You're one of them, and so in order for me to actually respond to that need, it takes about a week or a week and a half to be able to respond to it. We primarily, as is true in a lot of churches, we primarily offer financial assistance through other agencies that are better equipped to provide immediate assistance, like CEO. CEO is an organization in town that provides direct aid to respond to those needs. Usually our response to those who come to us is, have you asked CEO for help? And if you have, then help me understand why CEO wasn't able to either meet your need or to meet all of your need, and how can I help bridge the gap? There are certain things that are more difficult to get help with. It's pretty easy to get help for rent or utilities. It's a lot harder to get help for deposits on housing, because organizations are typically worried that they would get the money back when they leave, and we want that money back. So the church often helps with deposits. A gasoline assistance is difficult to get because almost always it comes in the form of cash or a cash equivalent. And often donors don't want to give direct aid. They would rather write a check for rent or utilities rather than to help with gas. A car repair is also something that is often needed, but that we have typical agencies have a hard time responding to, because again, how do I get the money to the mechanic so that the car, how do I verify the need? So that's often a way that we help, either with Uplift Auto, Adam Cox ministry and organization that's doing that work, or sometimes in some other ways. So that's the answer is almost always yes, but our ability to help immediately is somewhat limited. Occasionally we will offer to use a church credit card for some kind of temporary need. But again, usually there are other agencies in town that do a better job of that, and they're the ones who get those requests. So that's a good question. All right, let me play for you one more piece, and it's a video, and I'm not going to play the whole thing, and I'm going to share my sound. And let me play for you. This is on the New Leaf Project's website. They link to this, but I just want you to listen to these words about poverty. We're going to listen to about the first 4 or 5 minutes, I think, of this video. And listen to what it asks us to think about when it comes to poverty. We're gonna watch a commercial first, apparently. Ironically, for Lexi. Here we go.
I'd like to start with a simple question. Why do the poor make so many poor decisions? I know it's a harsh question, but take a look at the data. The poor borrow more, save less, smoke more, exercise less, drink more, and eat less healthfully. Why? Well, the standard explanation was once summed up by the British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, and she called poverty a personality defect. A lack of character, basically. Now, I'm sure not many of you would be so blunt. But the idea that there's something wrong with the poor themselves is not restricted to Mrs. Thatcher. Some of you may believe that the poor should be held responsible for their own mistakes, and others may argue that we should help them to make better decisions. But the underlying assumption is the same. There's something wrong with them. If we could just change them, if we could just teach them how to live their lives, if they would only listen. And to be honest, this was what I thought for a long time. It was only a few years ago that I discovered that everything I thought I knew about poverty was wrong. It all started when I accidentally stumbled upon a paper by a few American psychologists. They had traveled 8,000 miles all the way to India for a fascinating study. And it was an experiment with sugarcane farmers. You should know that these farmers collect about 60% of their annual income all at once, right after the harvest. And this means that they're relatively poor one part of the year and rich the other. And the researchers asked them to do an IQ test before and after the harvest. What they subsequently discovered completely blew my mind. The farmers scored much worse on the test before the harvest. The effects of living in poverty, it turns out, correspond to losing 14 points of IQ. Now, to give you an idea, that's comparable to losing a night's sleep, or the effects of alcoholism. A few months later, I heard that Elder Shafir, a professor at Princeton University and one of the authors of this study, was coming over to Holland, where I live. So we met up in Amsterdam to talk about his revolutionary new theory of poverty. And I can sum it up in just two words: scarcity mentality. It turns out that people behave differently when they perceive a thing to be scarce. And what that thing is doesn't much matter, whether it's not enough time, money, or food. You all know this feeling when you've got too much to do, or when you've put off breaking for lunch and your blood sugar takes a dive. You know, this narrows your focus to your immediate lack, to the sandwich you've got to have now, the meeting that's starting in 5 minutes, or the bills that have to be paid tomorrow. So the long-term perspective goes out the window. You could compare it to a new computer that's running 10 heavy programs at once. It gets slower and slower, making errors. Eventually it freezes, not because it's a bad computer, but because it has too much to do at once. Now, the poor have the same problem. They're not making dumb decisions because they are dumb, but because they're living in a context in which anyone would make dumb decisions. So suddenly, I understood why so many of our anti-poverty programs don't work. Investments in education, for example, are often completely ineffective. Poverty is not a lack of knowledge. A recent analysis of 201 studies on the effectiveness of money management training came to the conclusion that it has almost no effect at all. Now, don't get me wrong. This is not to say that the poor don't learn anything. They can come out wiser, for sure. But it's not enough. Or, as Professor Shafir told me, it's like teaching someone to swim and then throwing them in a stormy sea.
Let's stop there. So I want to pull from that a couple of things, and I want to start small and then get big or more foundational. The point that he was making at the end, and he expounds upon it, and again, absolutely worth a watch of the whole TED Talk. But the point that he was making at the end is essentially that most of our anti-poverty programs are designed to fix kind of the symptoms of poverty instead of the underlying issue. And so we think that it's a money management issue. And so we try to teach those who are poor how to manage the money better. But until they actually have the money to free themselves from the hunger or the fear or the anxiety or the scarcity mentality, to use the phrase that he borrowed, it doesn't really matter whether you teach them how to use money. That's not the issue. It's ineffective in that way. And I wonder if we could see how true that is in so many of our other approaches, that we try to we place conditions upon the assistance that we would offer often. And I'm not just speaking for me or for our church, but I think most who are helping, we say, all right, how is this going to be a long-term solution? How am I investing in your, is this sustainable? Will you be able to have the income you need to stay in your apartment? Or am I just paying a month's rent and a deposit that'll vanish as soon as you lose your income stream? But the reality is that you can't have a sustainable income stream until you've got a place to sleep at night, until you've got enough food to eat. How can we're asking them to always put the cart before the horse, and that's not fair. And the other, as I move from that specificity to the larger point, the other thing I want to pull from this teaching, which is so I find to be true in so many of our interactions with those who are experiencing poverty or homelessness, that we assume that the problem is them. We assume that there's something wrong with their character. The Margaret Thatcher quotation is damning, isn't it? But the point he goes on to make, which is we aim our anti-poverty efforts at trying to fix what's broken within a poor person. But what's really broken within a poor person is money. The problem is poverty. The rest is interesting because he goes on to say, the radical idea of providing a basic income, the radical idea of providing enough money for someone to have what they need and then structure their life. It sounds like this radical leftist socialist idea, but Thomas More, Thomas Paine, Martin Luther King, Friedman, lots of not quite so radical economists, philosophers, and politicians have had that idea. The idea being that how can we ever expect to change poverty if all we're doing is either responding to incremental needs or trying to fix a symptom instead of fixing the problem. Some illnesses, like the flu, for the most part, you just have to treat the symptoms. But poverty isn't one of those issues. Poverty is something that we can address at the root, at the cause. And as long as we're willing to provide a meal or a temporary shelter or a day shelter or a utility bill, as long as we're willing to do that, we're willing to help somebody in need, but we're not really willing to address the circumstance around us. And if we are people of faith, as we've made the case for the first 3 weeks in this series, if we are people of faith and we understand that we are called not only to respond to specific needs around us, but to begin to understand how God is working in the world through the life and experience of those who are poor, that changes our approach. It changes our approach in terms of our budgets. It changes our approach in terms of our economy. It changes our approach in terms of our politics. Those are consequential statements. People don't like it when clergy start to talk about politics. Don't worry, I will never tell you whom you should vote for. I will never tell you how you should vote on a particular issue. What I want to invite you to think about are the connections between what you believe as a follower of Jesus, who you are as a child of God, what our tradition teaches us about poverty, and to invite you to begin thinking not only about the incremental responses to particular needs, but to respond to the underlying problems, and that maybe it's as simple and as radical as making sure that people have enough, that people don't go hungry, and not only for a meal, but don't go hungry at all. How does that change our understanding of accountability, our conversations about eligibility, if we care less about justifying our magnanimity and instead responding to the needs of those around us? So that's a radical thing to say, but I invite your questions, your comments, your pushback. What would you say about that? Where do you feel the connections? How do you recognize organizations in your community doing this radical thing of giving out direct assistance, not just small chunks, but large chunks of direct assistance? And how might that approach change the way we act, either as a church or as individuals or as other organizations? What responses might you have to that? Kristen says it's easy to see how someone who has a small amount of cash would spend it on something short term like cigarettes or alcohol to be able to get through the day. Yeah, absolutely. My old boss in Montgomery used to say, when he would give somebody $20 out of his pocket and somebody would stop and say, "Aren't you worried he's going to spend that on beer?" He would say, "Well, I like to drink beer too. And if I had to sleep on a cardboard box, I might want something even stronger than beer," right? So the real point is, what are we really interested in doing? Absolutely. And that study, when incomes went up, the amount of money spent on cigarettes, alcohol, and whatever the other cigarettes and alcohol and something else decreased, right? What we label, and I'm guilty of it too, what we label as irresponsible use of funding, that decreased when income went up. So there's a curve, isn't there? And I haven't drawn it yet, but there's a curve that as income goes up, right? As income goes up, drug use might go up a little bit, but pretty quickly it falls off, right? Because I'm no longer using drugs to numb the reality of my experience. Instead, I'm able to provide food and shelter for myself, which means I don't want to live in an addicted life. Addiction is a whole nother conversation. And remember, yes, the study that I showed focused on recently homeless individuals who had a low experience of addiction. So it's a particular subset of the population of those experiencing poverty and homelessness. But what we see is that even casual drug or alcohol use goes down as income goes up. Yeah. Other responses, other concerns, questions, comments? I've had the luxury of going a little longer than last week because we've had to cancel our in-person worship. So I appreciate you hanging with me. Well, let's just think about it. I want you to think in your community here in Fayetteville, it's organizations like Seven Hills, like CEO, like St. James Missionary Baptist Church. There are organizations at the university like St. Martin's, but also churches like ours, St. Paul's, that are giving assistance. Instead of us thinking about how much money will we set aside to address immediate needs, who needs rent help, who needs utility help, who needs a little food today, what would it mean for us to start talking about making large investments in individuals' lives? The truth is that our organization, our church, doesn't have enough money, of course, to raise the income level of our community. Even though we've got a lot of resources, we're not able to do that. But we all have voice, we have vote, we have connection, and we have influence. What would it mean for us to use not only our financial resources, but our political, and by that I mean our polis, our community resources, to raise the issue until our community recognizes that what it means to be faithful is to make sure that there's no one poor among us, no one poor around us. Haley Hickson says that's putting more faith in humanity. I think that's right. Haley, you might have heard me say I probably have less faith in humanity than most. I come from that sort of total depravity, human condition, original sin perspective of theology. But what I would say is God loves us anyway. God loves us enough to set us free even from what holds us back, even from what is broken. And if we're going to participate in the having been set free from all that plagues us, that means we have to recognize that we can't be free until others are free. We can't be forgiven until we forgive others. And I don't just mean you hurt my feelings. I mean the economic debt and debtor language of forgiveness. So I think we're going to track on the same way, but you're right. It respects the dignity of every human being. I think we could agree on that for sure. Rebecca asks, when we think that if we give some money to someone and they're going to use it for negative things, is this not a prejudgment? Yeah, I think it is a prejudgment. We need to be responsible. We need to be responsible. Maybe, and it is not always responsible to give cash to someone who's asking for it. There are plenty of people. Well, not plenty of people. There are a number of people who will use fear and guilt and predatory tactics to try to get the resources that they want, not necessarily the resources that they need. So handing out money to somebody who asks for it is not always the right approach. But how much of our money should we be giving to places like CEO, Seven Hills, St. Paul's, St. James, other organizations, so that they can make strategic investments in individuals' lives. So imagine, and I'm going to use kind of a ridiculous example. This will be a good way for us to finish. Imagine if someone comes up to you in the parking lot of the grocery store and says, "Hey, I need a little money for gas." Imagine if instead you said, "Why don't I write you a $10,000 check so that you can get your life wherever you think your life needs to go?" Now, we're not going to do that. You're not going to do that. I'm not going to do that. But how might I be a part of the writing of $10,000 checks? How might I be a part of that kind of giving? How might we consolidate our resources and yet share them so freely that individuals aren't stuck in a life of scarcity, but invited into a life of abundance at their own direction? What does it mean to empower individuals like that? That's a transformation that Jesus has in mind. It's a transformation that God's people have understood throughout the centuries. It's a transformation that I get excited about. And so that's my invitation to us. I'm glad y'all been a part of the class. This was a fun way to end. I'll keep thinking about it, and I hope you will too. The Poor People's Campaign is absolutely worth our attention. I meant to say it earlier, but that's a bridge from the economic piece to the political piece. The Poor People's Campaign, nonpartisan, but clearly has a moral perspective, a moral compass, and they will advocate for and even demand justice for the poor. That includes the racial justice, but also economic justice. So look at the Poor People's Campaign as an example for how we might use our voice, not only our financial resources, but our voice, our political resources, to change the way our community addresses the needs of the poor. Susan Mays, a good concluding comment. Susan Mays, I think what you were describing, radical change in band-aiding, is exactly what we've seen with the evolution of Magdalene House and Seven Hills. Absolutely, it's about voting. It's about being politically active. It's about using our voice and our responsibility. That's absolutely right. We're not only interested in feeding someone, we're interested in changing the conversation about food and about poverty. It's a friend of mine and a colleague of mine used to say, you've always heard if you give somebody a fish, they'll eat for a day. If you teach somebody to fish, they'll be able to eat for a lifetime. What if we go fishing together? What if we go fishing together? What if we engage in a conversation about the resources around us that we need? Yeah. Thank y'all. It's good to be with you. Next week, something very exciting, and I hope you're looking forward to it too. Laura Walsh, the Reverend Dr. Laura Walsh, will start a 4-week series on the Bible as literature, and it'll be here on the YouTube, but also on the Zoom webinar. She will start that next week on Sunday, the 1st of November. We're going to pause for 1 week because we've got a great Tippy speaker coming to be with us on the 7th and the 8th, Marcus Halley, the Dean of Formation in the Diocese of Connecticut. He's going to come and talk to us about what does it mean to be a disciple of Jesus in this particular time. So that'll be a one-off on the 8th of November. And then Laura will pick back up with the remaining 3 weeks in her series. So 5 good weeks coming up, and I hope you'll join us. Let's finish our time today by saying the prayer that Jesus taught us. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. So good to be with you, and I hope you have a great day, and let's